So if you followed me with my various read-throughs from these newly released documents, then you'll know that I had concerns. I commented that I thought it was odd that the woman writing the documents had added her own opinions into the documents, specifically after the discussion of the polygraph exams. And I also expressed my concern that maybe she had a bit of confirmation bias, because she seemed to make allowances for inconsistencies from Daniel. I'd also noted that in terms of them having interviewed Malaya 5 times, she didn't differentiate what was said in what interviews. She just grouped it all together, or for the first 4 at least, grouped it all together into a single summary. And I questioned that because it made me question if she'd spotted any inconsistencies. Because as far as I can see, there is no way that her or Daniel could actually give accounts to the RCMP without inconsistencies, given what they have stated publicly. Now, I'll come back to that in a little while, but I noticed also that a lot of people either just decided outright that, yep, these documents clear everyone, or they were concerned that maybe the investigation was just not going in the right direction and that it was going to become a cold case because they were treating it like a straight out missing persons. But honestly, when you look at the big picture, it still looks like it is a criminal investigation. There are so many things that point towards it being a criminal investigation as opposed to simply a missing persons case. Now, I pointed out when I was going through the documents that in terms of the Missing Persons Act, then the definition for missing persons covers Lily and Jack perfectly, regardless of whether there is criminal activity or not. Now, one of the things that concerned me with the comments made by the person writing the reports was when she made comments like, oh, we were just doing polygraph tests just to verify the information that was given, or we're seeking this footage just to independently verify the information that we've been given. Because the way I read it made it sound like she just believed Daniel and Malaya hook, line and sinker. And this is despite the multiple signs that it was that it almost certainly is a criminal investigation. This case is being looked at by the Major Crime Unit. They are the ones in charge. You have the search being called off after less than a week, which is normally the sort of thing you're going to see if it's a criminal investigation, when they realise that, in fact, searching is going to be a recovery thing and that it's not a case of the children wandering off. They need to identify an area where the children may have been put. It is very rare to see an organisation call off a search that quickly unless it is a criminal investigation. They came out extremely early on and said that it was not an abduction, which is a bold move to make unless you are really, really certain it's not an abduction. Given the scarcity of evidence that would suggest these children wandered off into the woods, then that certainly does leave only the one option, that it is a criminal investigation. And then, of course, we have this reward that's been offered, this reward of $150,000, which is basically offered under a particular program that offers these rewards for the purpose of closing criminal investigations. Ask yourself this: if those children truly did wander off into the woods, and therefore the only people who saw them last would have been Janie, Malaya and Daniel, what's the purpose in offering a reward? Because unless someone lives in the woods and they just happen to see these two little children strolling by with Lily with her backpack and Jack with his dinosaur boots, then no one's going to have anything to bring forward. So a reward is pretty much useless. Anyway, I have gone through numerous things in the past in terms of why I strongly believe that it's still a criminal investigation. And I may well do a video down the track where I really dig into that. But that's not entirely the purpose of this video. What I wanted to look at in this video was what's been said in the documents and whether or not that does show that it is not a criminal investigation, that it is simply a missing persons investigation in terms of that they believe these children wandered off into the woods. End of story. They don't see anything criminal in anything in their investigation. So this one statement here is the thing that people have been parading around for, well, since the documents were first discussed by the media. This has been the main argument by people who believe that, well, this is definitely not a criminal investigation. Now, a few things about this. First of all, and I pointed this out in the first video I did on the documents, the purpose of these documents is to access records under the Missing Persons Act. This means that in terms of burden of proof, that is extremely low. All they have to offer up to be able to get these records is the fact that they have a missing person, or in this case, two missing persons, and they have to show that whatever the record is that they're trying to access will help further the investigation. So in terms of requesting footage for the Kobukid Pass, they explain that as basically just wanting to independently verify what Lily Sullivan told them. Same with various footage, camera footage from when the family were in town on the Thursday. Same with bank records. It's been phrased in these requests as basically just verifying the timeline, making sure that they've got the timeline correct, that sort of thing. This is different from putting in an application for a warrant in a criminal case, because when you are putting in an application for a warrant in a criminal case, you've got to prove just cause. You've got to prove that there is some solid, concrete evidence that makes you feel that, for example, taking these phones and having a look at these phones could prove that a criminal offence has occurred. The burden is far greater, because obviously when it comes to the point where you are accusing someone of a criminal act, then you damn well got to get it right, because it's going to have a huge impact on them, and legally they have got major comeback if you go through and you do a warrant without enough reason to do so. So because these requests are being made under the Missing Persons Act, basically means that in terms of what is being outlined in the document, the meat and potatoes part of it, they don't have to show all the various factors that make these people look suspicious. They've just got to show that there's this missing person and that these are the reasons why they want to access these documents. They're not trying to prove that anyone has done anything wrong. So essentially, the information that this person has provided in these documents is just a little snapshot of the investigation. It's not a full-on summary of every little microscopic element of the investigation. I mentioned in one of the videos, it's like looking through a keyhole. We're only seeing one small part of the room. She's not trying to convince the judge here that this is a criminal investigation. And you get these statements at the end of each document where they're basically saying that, you know, they believe that whatever it is they're after is going to help progress the investigation. So at the end of each of the documents, you have this paragraph that is essentially a summary paragraph. I believe a records access order under the Missing Persons Act to obtain copies of or access to the records of or related to the missing persons Lily Sullivan and Jack Sullivan will assist the RCMP Major Crime Unit in locating the missing persons by providing independent verification of information provided to police by Malaya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martel, and possibly obtaining information that may create new investigative leads in the event Malaya Brooks Murray and Daniel Martel overlooked information in the timeline of events they provided. So it's not saying, you know, we want to catch them out and prove that they've lied or anything. It's saying that this particular records access order will allow us to just check that they haven't accidentally missed out something in their timeline. And it's all very much like, oh, we trust Daniel and Malaya, because that's what this has to do. Okay, so going back to this investigator's comment at the top of the screen here, and I definitely was not happy with this. You heard me when I was doing the document read-throughs. I was not impressed. I said that I thought it was unprofessional for her to be expressing her opinion in this way, and it's been bugging me ever since. So I thought about it, and first of all I'll read it through, and then I'll explain what I think is actually going on here. So we know now that this investigator's comment under the information from the polygraphs is not a comment from the people who administered the polygraphs. This is a comment from the person writing the document. Now, I pointed out with the polygraphs, the only people who were actually listed as being completely cleared, as in it specifically said they had passed their polygraph, were Cody and Wade. With Malaya, Daniel and Cindy, there were redactions. There was reference to them being truthful only to particular things, 4 points that had been outlined, which we don't know what those questions were. So we're only given part of the story here with the polygraphs. Certainly it appears at first glance that they're cleared. But when you actually break it down, you realise that no, they're not. There's a lot of things that have been redacted here. And it says that they're only truthful, essentially, regarding these things. It doesn't outline what other things were asked, if other things were asked. And in some instances, you only get half the sentence when it says were deemed truthful. And then you can see they've blocked out a comma before finishing the sentence, whatever the sentence was. So we have this comment here, which is from the person writing the document, not from the person doing the polygraph tests. That is important. So they've said at this point in the investigation, Jack and Lily's disappearance is not believed to be criminal in nature. I do not have reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offence has occurred. Because Jack and Lily are still missing, polygraph examinations were conducted with the intention of ruling out that possibility. Like I said, I was spitting I was spinning chips when I read this. I had decided that this woman was a complete imbecile. Either that or she had some serious case of confirmation bias and couldn't see what was right under her nose. And then I calmed down a bit and I realised that, yeah, this document isn't about proving anyone's guilt. And I knew that from all the other cases that I've followed, everything about this case says criminal investigation. So I kept going back to this comment, this investigator's comment, and asking, why would she insert this into this document? So I decided to go back to the drawing board in terms of, now I've read through the Missing Persons Act a few times. While I've read through the different versions for the different provinces and looked at how it applies in Nova Scotia, when I've read through it in videos, I've always relied on basically a fact sheet, which puts it into simple wording for people to make it easier to understand. And when I looked at that fact sheet, you have this paragraph describing the limits of the information, of the use of the information. And it basically says the RCMP may only use the information gathered to locate the missing person. The information cannot be used for any other purpose except for a criminal investigation of the person's disappearance. And then once the person is found, records collected must be destroyed within 90 days. So with the Claire Bell case, we're not even meant to mention her name anymore. I actually privated my videos, even though I'm not Canadian. I still respect Canadian laws, and I can certainly appreciate the reasoning behind it. You know, this little girl doesn't want to be going to school and having people telling her, hey, I googled your name and guess what I found. So here's where I admit that I actually misinterpreted what they were saying here in terms of the limits on the information, or on the use of the information from the records. And it took me mulling over this statement by the person writing the report to actually reach that point. So I was asking myself, is there another reason why she would have to make this point here? That at this point in time, we don't believe it's criminal in nature. And that she does not have reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offence has occurred. So why was it important to point out in this document that she did not believe it was a criminal nature, given that, according to the fact sheet, it appeared that the information gathered could be used in a criminal investigation. And it occurred to me that I must have definitely misinterpreted. So, like I said, I went and had a look directly at what was the wording within the Act. And if you look at paragraph 7, part 2, the wording there is a bit clearer. It says, if the investigation into a missing person becomes a criminal investigation, this section does not prevent information and records obtained by a police service under this Act from being used in the criminal investigation. So it sounds very similar, but it definitely offers better clarity. Basically, what it is saying here is that, yes, they can gather information under this Act while it is a missing persons investigation. And then, if the investigation progresses to a criminal investigation, they're still allowed to use the records that they obtained while it was classified as a missing persons investigation. Essentially, this means that the moment the RCMP named this case up as a criminal investigation, then it's going to be harder for them to access the records that they need, because then there is a greater burden of proof and they're now seeking warrants as opposed to seeking record access, meaning that they've got to prove that they have good reason. They've got to prove that there is a criminal offence. So for the purpose of accessing these records, it's like in the United States when you have a missing child and smaller agencies will say, well, there is a possibility of abduction, because then they're going to get so many more resources thrown at them. They get the FBI in, they get the card teams. So it's about maximising the resources that you're going to get. So by basically keeping it as a missing persons investigation and not escalating it and calling it a criminal investigation, that meant that they could get easy access to all these records that they needed. They didn't have to go through the warrant process and for each one of these things that they needed, prove, like with solid concrete evidence, that it was going to help further this criminal investigation. So to give you an example, when I was a kid, we lived about 3 doors down from the corner store. So, you could go there and get takeaway food, really yummy hot fish and chips, or, bags of mixed lollies. And we learned early on that if we wanted a little bit of pocket money to go to the shop and buy a bag of mixed lollies, if we went to Dad and asked for the pocket money, we would have to do something to earn that pocket money first. If we went to Mum and we caught her in a good mood and asked for a bit of money to go buy some mixed lollies, she would probably give us that money and ask us to buy something for her. So obviously, we went for the path of least resistance. And this is the same thing. To get these records, because they were doing it under the Missing Persons Act, they were pretty much guaranteed that they would be given these records, because all they had to prove was that this will help them with their investigation in terms of maybe bring them closer to finding Jack and Lily. But the moment that it would cross over into a criminal investigation, then they really had to make sure that they had really good reason to be asking for a warrant, essentially. This is why you have this comment here where it says this matter involves 2 missing minors who are subject of this application. And then going down a bit, there are still investigative avenues remaining within this investigation, and the investigation may progress to a criminal investigation should the elements of a criminal offence be identified. So basically, in this document, she can't lay it on heavy in terms of anything that would suggest a criminal investigation, because the judge would turn around and say, actually, you cannot do this access order under the Missing Persons Act because your investigation, when I look at what you're saying here, is a criminal investigation. Go away and come back with an affidavit with a request for a warrant. So what she's done is actually quite skillful when you realise the parameters of what they're looking at here. She's done her best to word this document in a way that does make it sound like they are 100% convinced they are looking at a missing persons investigation. They are not progressing it to a criminal investigation at this point in time because they don't have anything that would suggest it. Because if they were to say, well, we want to get these records, we want this records access, we just want to point out here that Daniel has told us several different stories. We've interviewed Malaya 5 times because we couldn't get a consistent story from her. You know, the moment they said something that indicated that they were talking about a criminal investigation, then basically they have to work so much harder to get access to all these records, to get access to the surveillance. So they're working smart here. You will note that all these documents predate the reward being offered. Why is that? Because, like I said, the reward is normally offered for a criminal investigation. The whole purpose of the $150,000 reward is if someone provides information that allows for an arrest or achieves justice in a criminal investigation. Basically what they've done here is they've guaranteed themselves access to the records that they need, while at the same time giving themselves, well, guaranteeing that if this does go to court, if someone is prosecuted, that every bit of evidence that they obtained using under this act is covered, because the act clearly says that if it progresses, then anything they've obtained under the act can still be used. So no, we can't look at these documents and say, well, Daniel, Malaya and Janie have all been cleared. Look at the documents, they're talking about them as a missing person investigation and they're not saying that it is a criminal investigation, because essentially what they have done here is they have made use of the Missing Persons Act. They've basically had all these things still in forensics being processed. You know, she talks about in the documents, well, we've imaged the phones, but they haven't been fully looked at yet. We've sent the blanket off to be analysed by forensics. We haven't got those results yet. So all the things that could point towards a criminal investigation, at the point when she's writing these documents, they haven't got any forensic information back. I mean, you just have to look at things like, in terms of the 3 officers who administered the polygraph tests, one of those officers is from Newfoundland. So they had to pay his travel costs. They had to pay his accommodation to bring him in to administer those polygraph tests. I'm not sure why they needed 3 separate people to do it, but for some reason they got that particular guy in, not a local. That's a huge expense to do a polygraph test if you believe that these children have just simply wandered off into the woods and gotten lost. It's a large outlay to be making if it's not a criminal investigation. All we can take away from looking at these documents is that they have basically made use of the Missing Persons Act to gain access to as many documents, as many surveillance images, videos, etc., as they possibly can, while the case is still at a point where they can describe it as a missing persons investigation. And this Corporal Curl, who wrote this application, has been very careful about how she gave the information. That's why we only get this summary of 4 interviews with Malaya and no reference to any inconsistencies, because that would be shooting them themselves in the foot, basically. The judge would say, well, if you look at what you're saying here about these interviews, you should be investigating this as a criminal investigation. Go away, get me a warrant, a warrant application. When you really break it all down, and when you actually go and look at the actual act as opposed to a fact sheet of the act, then it is quite clear that basically, yes, maybe at the point that this document was put in, they were calling it a missing persons investigation. That doesn't necessarily mean that they considered it as that. They were basically doing what they could to get everything possible to help their investigation in the easiest possible way. We have no idea where this investigation has gone since the date on the last of these documents. But I feel pretty confident that they are actually treating it as a criminal investigation. So on that note, thanks for listening. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe. Please also hit that like button. YouTube loves that, gets this out into the algorithm. And please leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on if you still think it's just a missing persons investigation, or if you believe that, yes, it is perhaps a criminal investigation. So thank you, and I will catch you in the next one.
Give a fuck about me.